My mother-in-law announced it at Christmas dinner, in front of 14 people, that I had never been good enough for her son. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, pleasantly, with a glass of Chateau Pichon in her hand, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Terrence deserves someone who can actually keep up with this family. She didn't look at me when she said it, she looked at her son. Like I wasn't worth the energy of eye contact. 14 people heard it. 14 people looked down at their plates. My husband laughed it off the way he laughed off everything his mother did. She doesn't mean it like that. He said this so often over 11 years of marriage that the words had worn smooth as river stones, frictionless, meaningless. I didn't cry that night. I had stopped crying about Rosalind Vance somewhere around year 4. What I did was carry the dishes to the kitchen, wash them with the precision of a woman who has learned to make herself invisible in rooms that don't want her, and quietly decide that I was done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Delaney Oakes. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of city that builds you tough whether you want it to or not. My father worked 22 years at the Falconbridge nickel smelter. My mother cleaned rooms at the Holiday Inn on Regent Street until her knees gave out. We were not a family that had a word for legacy. We had a word for Sunday. Sunday meant church. Sunday meant my grandmother's butter tarts. Sunday meant my father falling asleep in the recliner with the hockey game on. That was our inheritance. Terrence Vance came from a different kind of Sunday entirely. I met him at Laurentian University in the library of all places during second year. He was studying commerce. I was studying nursing. He had a laugh that filled the whole reading room and the most disarming habit of apologizing to furniture when he bumped into it. He was warm and bright and completely unlike anyone I had grown up around, and I fell in love with him the way you fall into cold water in August. Fast, gasping, and completely unable to stop. His family was another matter. The Vances were old money by Northern Ontario standards, which is a very specific kind of old money. Not Bay Street, not Rosedale, but established. His grandfather had built a mining supply company in the 1950s that his father had grown into something considerably more comfortable. They lived in a house on Lake Ramsey with a dock and a boathouse. Rosalind Vance wore silk blouses to barbecues and had opinions about which grocery stores were acceptable. She told Terrence, 6 weeks after meeting me, that I seemed very sweet for someone from my background. I know this because he told me. He told me laughing, like it was a compliment she had almost delivered successfully. I should have listened to what that laugh was telling me. We got married when I was 26. The wedding was at the Vance family property. Rosalind chose the flowers. She chose the caterer. She suggested gently that my mother's butter tart recipe might not be quite right for the reception menu, and could she recommend a bakery? My mother said, of course, that would be wonderful. And I watched her spend the rest of the afternoon pretending she wasn't hurt. That was the first thing I couldn't forgive. The second thing came 3 years later, when I miscarried at 11 weeks, and Rosalind, standing in the hospital corridor, having arrived uninvited, wearing her good wool coat, said very quietly that perhaps it wasn't the right time anyway, given that Terrence was so busy with the company transition. Terrence was outside parking the car. He didn't hear it. I did. I held that sentence inside my chest for 8 years. I held it the way you hold a stone at the bottom of a lake. It doesn't go anywhere. It just presses. The Christmas dinner announcement was the third thing. On the drive home, I watched the snow come down over the Trans-Canada in the headlights of our Subaru, and I understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when you've been very patient for a very long time, that Rosalind Vance had spent 11 years communicating one message to me: you do not belong here. And Terrence, my warm, laughing furniture apologizing husband, had spent 11 years choosing not to hear it. That is not a man defending his mother. That is a man who has decided that keeping the peace is more important than keeping his wife. I filed for divorce in February. My lawyer was a woman named Delphine Achibi, Sudbury-born, sharp as a surgical edge, with absolutely no patience for crying in her office. She told me to go home, make a list of every joint asset I could document, and come back on Thursday prepared to work. I made the list. It took 4 hours. I'm a good nurse, I am thorough and precise, and I do not leave things out. The separation was not quiet. Rosalind made sure of that. She called my mother twice, which I only learned about later, and had conversations that I will not repeat here because my mother carried them alone and told me about them months afterward, at her kitchen table, with her hands folded and her voice very careful, and it is the only time in my adult life that I have wanted to be truly unkind to another human being. I moved into a rental on Larch Street in April. Ground floor, 2 bedrooms, the second of which I turned into an exercise room because I'd started running again. Something I hadn't done since university. The first morning back in running shoes, I made it 4 blocks before I had to stop and lean against a utility pole in the March cold and breathe. I made it 8 blocks the next morning. By June, I was running 10 kilometers before my shift. There is something that happens to your body when you stop managing other people's feelings. It takes a few months to notice. the tension across your shoulders, the one you'd stopped registering because it had become your baseline. It begins, very slowly, to release. You sleep differently. You start tasting food again. You catch yourself laughing at things without calculating whether the laugh is appropriate for the room. I started noticing, in a distant observational way, that I had spent 11 years slowly disappearing. I wasn't angry about it. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something colder than anger and more useful, the specific, focused energy of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to see her worth and decided to see it herself. My nursing position was at Health Sciences North. I'd been in the surgical unit for 7 years, circulating nurse, then scrub nurse for orthopedic and general surgery. I was good at my job with the kind of efficiency that surgeons depend on without thinking about, the same way they depend on the lights being on. I had covered for colleagues. I had worked doubles. I had on one occasion stayed 4 hours past the end of my shift because the incoming nurse was sick and the patient in recovery needed continuity. I had never once been told I wasn't enough at that hospital. That September, I was asked to sit on a provincial nursing advisory panel. It was a 2-year appointment, quarterly meetings in Toronto, work that would eventually inform staffing policy across Northern Ontario. My supervisor nominated me. The panel coordinator called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was eating lunch in the break room, and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the Ottawa area code. I almost missed it. I thought about that later. How close I had come, through ordinary inattention, to not answering. The first panel meeting was in October, in a government building on Bay Street. I drove down the night before, stayed at a Hampton Inn near Union Station, and walked 40 minutes through the downtown in the early morning because I couldn't sleep and the city was extraordinary at 6 a.m., that specific Toronto quiet before the financial district wakes up, the lake visible at the end of certain streets, the sky that particular shade of gray. That means the temperature is about to change. I had a coffee at a place on King Street and sat by the window and watched the city move and thought, I am 43 days into the rest of my life. The panel meeting was good. The work was substantive. I sat across from a palliative care physician from Thunder Bay who had the same thing I had, that quality of people who have spent years in rooms where things are actually at stake, where the details matter, where there is no room for performance. We talked through a lunch break. Her name was Dr. Ewan. She had driven 11 hours because she didn't trust her flight connection. I liked her immediately. On the way back to my hotel that evening, I cut through a pedestrian walkway along Wellington Street, a shortcut a woman at the registration desk had mentioned, and that is where it happened. The alley itself was nothing remarkable. Service entrance for the hotel complex, couple of dumpsters, overhead lighting working perfectly well. I was on my phone, reading a text from my mother, "Did you eat a real dinner?" And I walked around a corner and directly into someone moving in the opposite direction. I hit a wall. That is the only way to describe it. The person I collided with did not move. I bounced off him and dropped my phone and would have hit the pavement if his hand hadn't caught my arm with a reflexive speed that I registered before I registered anything else about him. I straightened. I looked up. The man was tall, 6'2", maybe more, with a stillness about him that was immediately disorienting. Not stillness like calmness. Stillness like the ocean before a weather system arrives. He was perhaps 50, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that fit the way expensive things fit. His face was the kind of face that has survived things and shows it. A healed cut along the left cheekbone, eyes that were doing what I would later identify as a rapid environmental assessment of everything around me. Behind him, slightly to his left, a second man, younger, thicker, hands already moving. I picked up my phone. The screen was cracked. "I'm so sorry," I said, because that is what you say when you walk into someone. The tall man didn't move. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not threatening, not warm, not anything I had a word for. His eyes had stopped on my face with a precision that felt almost clinical. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was Quebec accented, very slightly, the way English sounds when French is the first language. "No," I said. I wasn't looking where I was going. The second man behind him said something low in French that I caught only partially, on doit yala. "We have to go." The tall man didn't respond to him. He was still looking at me. Then he said with no particular inflection, "You're bleeding." I looked at my hand. I had caught the edge of the dumpster when I stumbled. A clean line across my palm, not deep, the kind of thing you categorize and dismiss before it has time to bother you. "It's nothing," I said. "Occupational habit. I'm a nurse." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A fraction. "Lanthier," he said to the man behind him without turning his head. "The kit! We really don't have time. The kit." The younger man produced a small black case from somewhere inside his jacket with the specific resigned efficiency of someone who has learned not to argue. The tall man took it, opened it, and held it out to me, not pushing it on me, just making it available, like he understood the difference between offering and insisting. I almost said no thank you and walked away. Instead, I took out a gauze pad, folded it, pressed it against my palm, professional reflex. You do that like you've done it 1,000 times, he said. About 4,000, I said. Surgical unit. He watched me. Not the way men sometimes watch women, with that assessing quality that is fundamentally about them, not you. He watched me the way I watch a patient when I'm trying to understand something I don't have all the information for yet. You're not from Toronto, he said. Sudbury. Up for a conference. He nodded slowly, then he said, My name is Matthew Renaud. He said it like it was information I might want to store carefully. I told him my name. He repeated it back to me with the slightly careful quality that means someone is committing it to memory, not just being polite. Walk carefully, he said. The light on the far side of this alley is out. There's a step down that isn't marked. Then he walked past me, the second man following, and I stood in the alley for a moment with a gauze pad on my hand and my cracked phone, and the particular feeling of having been seen very thoroughly by someone in under 3 minutes. I did not think about him again that night. Or so I told myself. His name appeared in my browser history the next morning, which told me something about myself that I chose not to examine too closely over hotel breakfast. What I found was not nothing. Mathieu Renaud, 51. Born in Chicoutimi, MBA from HEC Montreal, CEO of Renault Capital Holdings, a private equity firm operating primarily out of offices in Montreal and Toronto. Board member of 2 hospitals, a children's literacy foundation, a northern infrastructure fund, the kind of public profile that is substantial and carefully maintained and tells you almost exactly nothing about the person behind it. The photograph on the company website was clearly years old and taken by someone who had not gotten close to what was actually in his face. I closed the tab. I drove back to Sudbury. I went to work Monday morning. He emailed me 11 days later. I don't know how he found my address. I didn't ask at first because the email itself was so unexpected in its directness that the question of how got temporarily displaced by the question of what. Ms. Oakes, it said, I have been thinking about the conversation in the alley with a frequency I did not expect. I would like the opportunity to continue it if you're willing. I realize this is an unusual request from a stranger. I also realize I don't have a better explanation than the true one. I have been in rooms with a great many people, and very few of them have the quality you have. I don't yet know what to call that quality. I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to figure it out. Mathieu Renaud. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my friend Kezia. She's the kind of friend who will tell you exactly what she thinks without softening the edges, with the subject line, What do I do with this? And she called me within 4 minutes and said, Delaney, that man is trying to court you like it's 1987, and I am here for every second of it. Say yes. I said yes. We met for dinner in Sudbury, his suggestion, which surprised me, at a restaurant on Elgin Street that I had always liked and had assumed no one traveling from Toronto would want to go to. He arrived exactly on time, already seated at a corner table with a clear sightline to both entrances, and I noticed that about him immediately. The corner, the sightlines. The specific way of occupying a room that belongs to people who have learned to know where the exits are. I sat down across from him and he said, without preamble, How's your hand? The cut had healed cleanly within 5 days. I told him so. He nodded like this had been a genuine concern and not just small talk, and that set the tone for the entire evening. He was not a man who made small talk. He asked real questions and waited for real answers. He told me about Chicoutimi in the 1980s, about his father's hardware store, about learning English from television, and eventually outpacing every English kid in his commerce program through sheer determination and what he called the specific fury of someone who has been told they don't quite fit. I understood that fury intimately. We talked for 3 hours. He drove me back to my building on Larch Street and walked me to the door and shook my hand. Not kissed my cheek, not hugged me, shook my hand, with the solemnity of someone who means what they do, and said, I'd like to do this again. So would I said. Over the following 4 months, Mathieu drove to Sudbury 6 times. I drove to Toronto twice. We went to the Art Gallery of Ontario. We walked the Rideau Canal in November when it was stupid with cold, and he bought me a hot chocolate from a cart, and we argued, genuinely argued, with positions and evidence, about whether the early group of 7 painters were responding to landscape or inventing it. I had never argued about painting with a man before. I had never been in a relationship where argument was considered a form of affection. He told me, on that canal walk, that he had been married once, for 9 years, and that the divorce had been mutual and civil and had ended because they had both, as he put it, grown into people the other one didn't choose. He said it without bitterness and without performance. He said it the way people say things that are simply true. He asked about my marriage. I told him about Terence, not the worst of it, not yet, but the shape of it. The 11 years of managed absence, the Christmas dinner. He listened without interjecting. When I finished, he said, he let her do that. 3 words, not a question. A verdict. I looked at him. He let her do that to you, he said again. For 11 years because it was easier than not letting her. and you stayed because you thought love was supposed to be something you earned. The canal was very quiet around us. That's not what love is, he said. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He reached over and tucked my scarf more firmly into my coat collar with the unselfconscious ease of a man who notices cold and does something about it, and we kept walking. I think that was the moment. In January, Kezia called me and said, I looked him up. I know, I said. Delaney, I know, Renaud Capital isn't just private equity. I was sitting in my kitchen. I had a mug of tea. Outside, the Sudbury winter was doing what Sudbury winter does. Determined, unornamental, absolute. I know, I said, for the third time, because I had been sitting with what I knew for 6 weeks, turning it over, understanding its weight. Tell me what you found. Kezia had found the things that don't appear on the HEC Montreal alumni page. The connections that surface if you know how to read corporate filings, the shell companies incorporated in Cayman Islands branches that fed back into Renaud Capital in ways that served no obvious legitimate purpose. The associations going back 20 years with certain figures in organized labor disputes that had resolved in ways that stretched probability. The name of a Sûreté du Québec investigator who had apparently been interested in Renaud Capital for 3 years and had not yet found what she was looking for. He's not just a businessman, Kezia said. No, I said. He's not just a businessman. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because it is important and I have thought about it many times since. I was not afraid. I was not naive. I am 38 years old, and I grew up in a city where you understand early that the men who run things are not always the men who appear to run things. I had spent 7 years in a surgical unit watching human beings in their most vulnerable states, and I understood, in my body rather than my head, the difference between danger that means you harm and danger that means something more complicated. What I felt was a very careful, very clear I need to understand what I am dealing with before I take another step. I drove to Toronto 3 weeks later. I told him I had 2 days and nowhere I needed to be. We went to the St. Lawrence market Saturday morning, and he bought cheese and bread with the focused pleasure of a man who has never lost the habit of caring about ordinary things. Saturday night, we made dinner at his apartment, the kind of dinner that takes 2 hours because you keep stopping to argue about technique, and afterward we sat with the last of the wine, and the city lit up below the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I said, "Tell me what Renaud Capital actually is." He went very still. Not the way people go still when they're deciding whether to lie. The other kind. The kind that means they have been waiting for this question, and they are deciding how much truth to carry into the room. That's a precise question, he said. I'm a precise person. He looked at me for a long time. Then he set down his wineglass with the deliberate care of someone setting down something heavier than a wineglass. Some of what I do, he said slowly, operates in the spaces between what the law covers clearly and what it doesn't. I need you to be more specific than that. He was quiet for a moment. There are people in this country, he said, and in other countries who have resources they cannot account for publicly. They need those resources to become something they can account for. I provide that service. I have provided it for 22 years. I am very careful, very deliberate, and I have never harmed anyone. You've also never been charged, I said. No, the Sûreté investigator. He looked at me differently. You did your work. I do my work. He nodded slowly. She's been looking for 3 years. She won't find what she's looking for because it isn't where she's looking. But she's tenacious, and eventually she'll reframe the question. And when she does, I'll have perhaps a year before she has enough. And then? And then I will retire. To somewhere with a reasonable property tax rate and good internet. I should say that the wine was very good, and that the city was very beautiful below us, and that I am not a woman who makes decisions like the one I made next without understanding exactly what she is doing. Matthew, I said, I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it the same way you'd answer a question under oath. He nodded. Have you ever given an order that ended with someone being hurt? The silence was long enough that I counted my own heartbeats. No, he said. That is not the business I am in. I move money. I do not move men. I looked at him. I have spent 7 years watching people's faces in the highest stakes moments of their lives. You learn in that work to see past what people intend to show you. He was telling me the truth. What I said next surprised us both. Then I'm going to tell you something, I said, and I want you to listen carefully. He leaned forward slightly. I know what the investigator's name is, I said. I know she presented preliminary findings to her supervisor in November and was told to broaden the scope. I know she is currently pursuing a parallel approach through the numbered companies in the Alberta registry, which is 6 months behind where she needs to be. I know this because her supervisor is a man named Gerald Theriot who sits on the same provincial advisory panel I do, and who is not as careful as he should be about what he discusses at lunch when he believes the people around him are not listening. Matthew Renaud had not moved. I have been listening, I said, for 11 years, in rooms where I was not considered significant, and I heard things. I remember things. It is a skill I developed in a marriage where the only way to protect myself was to understand the room better than anyone else in it. And then I joined that panel, and I started hearing different things, and I did not know what to do with them until I met you. He was very still. I'm not asking you to involve me, I said. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you how I know it, and I'm telling you that I have been in rooms my entire life where people looked past me, and I paid close attention to every single thing they said. And some of what they said is useful to you. The question is what you want to do about it. I poured the last of the wine into my glass. My hands were completely steady. What I did not tell him that night was how long I had been paying attention. Not just the 4 months I had known him. Longer than that, I had joined the provincial panel in October. Gerald Theriot had been indiscreet at lunch on the third meeting, November 14th. I had noted precisely what he said about a financial crimes investigation in progress and the name of the investigator and the approach she was taking. And I had not known, in November, that I would ever be in a position to use it. But I had written it down. Precisely, in the way I document patient intake, because I do not leave things out. I had written it down because I have spent 11 years learning that the rooms where people look past you are the rooms where the most important things get said. Terence Vance's mother stood at a Christmas table and told 14 people, with a glass of Chateau Pichon in her hand, that I would never be enough for her family. She was looking at her son when she said it. She was not paying attention to me. She never paid attention to me. That was her mistake. It is everyone's mistake. What happened in the months after that night in Matthew's apartment is not something I will describe in detail, because some of it is not mine alone to describe, and some of it is simply private in the way that the most important things are private. Not secret, just interior, just the kind of meaning that loses something when it is made into a story. What I will say is this. The Sûreté investigator shifted her approach in March. She did not find what she had been looking for, because by March, what she had been looking for was no longer where it had been. Matthew Renaud is, as of this writing, a man who chairs a genuinely legitimate infrastructure fund and sits on hospital boards and buys excellent cheese at the St. Lawrence Market on Saturday mornings. He also, in March, drove 4 hours to Sudbury, for no reason other than to take me running on the Ramsey Lake Trail at 6 a.m. in the dark, and then make me breakfast and sit across my kitchen table with the specific ease of a man who has decided where he belongs. I signed the divorce papers in April. Terence did not contest anything of significance. His mother, I was told by a mutual acquaintance, had opinions about the settlement. I did not think about Rosalind Vance's opinions. I had stopped thinking about Rosalind Vance's opinions. It turned out that this, like most things I had been afraid to do, was as much easier than I had expected. My mother came to Sudbury for a long weekend in May. She and Matthew met over butter tarts, her recipe, at my kitchen table, and he had too, and then asked her, very seriously, whether the trick was the brown sugar or the pastry ratio. And she told him it was the pastry, and proceeded to spend 40 minutes explaining the method in the particular focused way she gets when someone has asked a genuine question about something she cares about. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and watched my mother teach a man I love how to make butter tarts. And the thing I felt was not complicated. It was just quiet, just full. The way things feel when they are right. There are women who spend years in rooms where they are not seen, who learn to be small, to manage, to absorb, to disappear a little more with every year because it is easier than fighting every day for the space they deserve. Who listen, carefully, to everything said in the rooms where they are overlooked because listening is the only power they have been left with. I want to say something to those women. Keep listening, write it down, be precise. The room where someone is not paying attention to you is the room where the most important things are said. And the day will come, I promise you this. I say it from the specific knowledge of someone who has lived it. When what you have gathered quietly in all those overlooked years becomes exactly what you needed. You were never background. You were always the one taking notes.